harmless and good are not the same thing at all. And in fact, I think one of the best ways of characterizing like a higher order morality, and this is something that Nietzsche talked about a fair bit, is that, and Jung as well, with regards to the idea of integration of the shadow, is that someone who's moral has the capability for violence and the capability for aggression built in and at hand, but is also someone who's perfectly capable of controlling that in a civilized manner. So I would say that one of the things that men should do as they mature is transform themselves into monsters, but also become civilized at the same time. And that's exactly what you see in stories like Beauty and the Beast, where the ideal man starts out as a beast and ends up civilized. He doesn't start out as a milksop, wimp sort of character who poses no threat to anyone and then becomes the hero. That isn't how it works, although there are stories of that kind of development. One of the things that men should do as they mature is transform themselves into monsters, but also become civilized at the same time. And that's exactly what you see in stories like Beauty and the Beast, where the ideal man starts out as a beast and ends up civilized. He doesn't start out as a milksop, wimp sort of character who poses no threat to anyone and then becomes the hero. That isn't how it works, although there are stories of that kind of development.
The reason that Harry Potter can withstand Voldemort is because he's got a piece of him. Right, he's been touched by it, and the way that you keep the psychopaths at bay is to develop the inner psychopath so that you know one when you see one, right? And then, but that's a voluntary thing. It's like a set of tools that you have at your disposal, which is full knowledge of evil.
Because most people who are cowards disguise their cowardice as morality, and they claim that their harmlessness, which is actually a consequence of their fear and inability to be harmful, say, or to be dangerous, is actually a sign of their moral integrity. And that's a really bad idea. So, if you're an axe murderer but you don't have an axe, that doesn't mean that you're moral. So now, with regards to, so that's the persona. And the persona is the mask that you wear, and that's what persona means, is the mask that you wear to convince yourself and the world that you're not a terrible monster, so that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't have to run away screaming. And you might think, well, that's a bit of an overstatement, but Jung was very interested in phenomena such as, say, the psychological phenomena that would characterize the actions of someone who might be an Auschwitz camp guard, for example. And, that's a pretty monstrous form of behavior. And the thing about Auschwitz camp guards is that there's no reason to assume, really, that they were much different than normal people. Now, there would have been exceptions, obviously, and what that means is that perhaps you too could be an Auschwitz camp guard, and perhaps you would even derive some enjoyment out of it, and you might think not, but you shouldn't think not so quickly. And what that also implies is that if you could see what that meant when you looked in the mirror and looked at yourself, you might run away screaming, because you'd have a revelation of just exactly what the human being is capable of. And that's a very unpleasant revelation, and also one of the things that stops people from being enlightened, because that revelation of the evil of the self is part of the journey to enlightenment, and an early part. Now, the shadow would be all the parts of the personality that the persona rejects, and that might be the aggressive elements. Certainly that's the case for people who are hyper-agreeable. And now you can tell, I think one of the best, there's two pathways to the development of the shadow, and they're tightly allied with one another. The fundamental pathway is truth, and that's to face the bitter truth about yourself. But to break that down more particularly, you might think about that as the capacity to observe your own resentment. You're going to be resentful and bitter in many situations because you don't get what you want. And if you watch that resentment and bitterness, you'll see that it produces fantasies that can be unbelievably dark. And that can be very frightening, and you might not want to admit to yourself that you're actually capable of having fantasies like that, or impulses like that, or aggressive feelings like that. But the thing is that if those aggressive feelings and impulses and fantasies are integrated into your character, it's like you're opening up a dialogue with a part of yourself that can be very forceful and strong and dangerous. And it's really useful to be dangerous, because if you can be dangerous, you often don't have to be. And it's often weak people. For example, it's weak men, generally speaking, who rape. that's a very, very common occurrence, and that's a violent act, but it's born out of weakness, not out of strength, that's for sure. And so, anyways, you attend to your resentment honestly, and you observe yourself and what you're actually like. You got to pay attention as if you don't know yourself, as if you might harbor hidden devils, and then maybe they'll emerge. Now, Jung also felt that sort of embedded inside the shadow were the contrasexual tendencies. And so, for example, sometimes you see people who are well-developed, men, let's say, and we can also talk about women in this regard. Men who've integrated their shadow often also develop a kind of peculiar grace that would be a consequence of not only allowing their aggressive side to step forward, but also their feminine and compassionate side that they may have kept squelched because of embarrassment about it, or because they'd been harassed for being weak, or any number of things. So, but the practical approach for developing your shadow, I would say, is to contemplate and consider your resentment and notice what it says. And because your resentment will also tell you what you have to say. So look at what happened at Google this weekend. James Damore wrote that memo, and you can imagine he was pretty angry and perhaps even somewhat resentful at having to attend that diversity seminar. And I'm really just using this as an example. But what he did was decide that meant that he had something that he had to say. And then look at the consequences of that, man. It's absolutely unbelievable. And so, if you're feeling oppressed at work, or you're oppressed in your life, or you're oppressing yourself, then you got to notice that you're feeling oppressed. Then you have to notice that you're feeling resentful and angry and bitter, and maybe even like Cain in the story of Cain and Abel, because Cain is sort of the archetypal bitter man. And then you have to decide what it is that you need to do in order to remove from yourself that bitterness. And that usually means that there's something that you have to say. And then you have to say it because your soul depends on it. And not only does your soul depend on it, I would say the fate of the world depends on it. Because, you might be wrong, and then you should be straightened out. Maybe you're just being whiny and you have to talk to somebody about that. But it may be that you're actually detecting something wrong, some tyranny that's directed towards you and other people, and it's like your moral obligation to speak up about it. And so many workplaces become toxic, to use a terrible cliche, because the people in them won't speak up for what they actually want, or they speak up too late, and then they're all twisted up about it, and they're torturing other people because they're so unhappy, and so forth and so on. So, practical approach for developing your shadow fundamentally is radical honesty. And Jung said that a genuine moral effort was a good substitute for psychotherapy. But, you watch all those rom-coms where there's always kind of a beta male guy who's being real friendly and always failing miserably with the women because basically he's lying to himself and to them. He's a persona. And a persona is the face that you show to the world when you're trying to pretend and to convince yourself and others that you're, I would say, harmless, but we could say a good person. But a good person isn't harmless. A good person is capable of, well, maybe a good person is capable of anything, but is willing to hold that in abeyance. I read this interesting commentary a little while ago on a statement by Christ in the New Testament, and the statement generally interpreted is that the meek shall inherit the earth. But I was looking up the multiple translations of the word meek, and meek is actually derived from a Greek word, of course, because the Bible, at least some of the original forms of the Bible, were in Greek. And that word didn't exactly mean meek. It meant something like those who have weapons and the ability to use them, but determined to keep them sheathed, will inherit the world. And that means that people who are capable of force, let's say, but decide not to use it, are in the proper moral position. And
the feeling that you have as a soldier or as a military person, the feeling that you have going on an offensive operation, where let's say you're a bad guy and I'm going to come and get you at night. Well, first of all, you don't know, and I'm sneaking up on you, and I have all this power, right? I feel good about it. I'm going to get you. The opposite of that is when I'm doing a convoy or I'm going on a patrol where now the bad guys are out there, they're waiting to attack me. And that is a defensive posture. And your attitude about that type of thing is bad. Now, we would train our guys that we made a specific point with my guys. I would say, look, when you're on patrol, we're on offense. We are scanning. We are looking to get us to be standing up straight and to get the mentality of we want to do this and we're moving towards the target as opposed to we're being chased. That's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely, that's a big deal. Yeah, and that's what would you say? That's an extreme example of what's necessary under normal conditions in life. So, one of the things that happens if you're treating someone who has a phobia, say like agoraphobia, so they become afraid of virtually everything. Maybe they're afraid of an elevator. It's one of many fears. And so you think, well, and they're afraid of an elevator because they've actually gone in elevators and had panic attacks. So it's weird because what you do to cure them is to get them to go in elevators. And you think, well, wait a second, that's actually what caused the problem. So how can getting them to do that again make it better? And the answer is because they've gone in elevators their whole life, right? And yet they still become terrified. So how can getting them to go in an elevator cure them? For a long time, people thought, well, you get them to relax while they were in the elevator, and the pairing of the relaxation with being in the elevator taught them to not be afraid. That was the first theory. But then people learned that no, you could just get them to go in the elevator without having them relax, and it also worked. And eventually psychologists sorted this out, and what they figured out was that voluntarily encountering something you're afraid of is not the same thing as running from it. Like, it's seriously not the same thing. So you say to the person, okay, you're afraid of the elevator. Can you go look at an elevator? And they usually say yes. And maybe they're so terrified because they're so far gone in their illness that they can't. You say, well, how about we look at a bunch of pictures of elevators? And it's like virtually everyone can do that. So we say, let's look at pictures of elevators till you're bored. That actually doesn't take very long because it's actually quite boring. So then the next thing would be, well, let's go. You have to have the person trust you. And so the rule is, look, we're going to do some things that are going to push you, like competition.
Right.
But you can stop whenever you want, and we're not going to push you any farther than is good for you. And I'll stop anytime you want. I often practice with my clients, like I taught one client a while back to not be afraid of needles. And he was afraid of needles. And I'll tell you what that meant. He had dental surgery with no anesthesia. Oh. Right. Okay, so that gives you some level of what it's like to be afraid. It's like, I'll do the dental surgery, but you're not putting that needle in there. It's really? Wow. It's like, I'm no needles. So I taught him how to not be afraid of needles, and it didn't take very long. But the first thing I did is I told him I was going to bring a needle into the office. And that was all I told him the first week is next week I'm going to bring a needle in here and I'm going to keep it sheathed. And it's going to be sitting on a shelf, and that's where I'm going to put it. And when you come in here, you can look at it. And if you want me to put it away, then I'll put it away. It's under your control. And then, so he was okay with that. So he came in, I said, there's the needle. I said, you want to look at it? He said, no. He said, but can you? It's like, I'll look at it. So he looked at it. And then he said, look, like, I'm going to pick up the needle. And now what you're going to do is you're going to tell me to put it down. And I'm going to put it down. So I picked it up, and he got nervous, like right away. And he said, will you put that down? I put it down right away. I said, we do that 10 times so that the bottom part of your nervous system actually knows that that's what's going to happen. He said, now, and then the next thing we'll do is we're going to practice you saying you've had enough and leaving the office. So I'd pick up the needle, and he'd say, okay, so now you say you've had enough, I'm leaving. And so he said that, and then I'd let him leave. We did that like 10 times so that he knew that he could just say he'd had enough and leave. So that meant he didn't have to be a prey animal, right? So we were getting him out of that mode. And it didn't take very long until, well, then I could bring the needle close to him. And I say, make sure you watch it. You can't pretend it's not there, right? I'll bring it close to him and touch it, and touch him with the sheathed needle. So we did that a bunch. And then finally, I unsheathed it, and I'd bring it close. And he'd tolerate that or stop me. And then I'd touch him with that. And then the last part of it was that I put it under a piece of paper so he couldn't see it, and then I'd bring it close to him, right? Because that was the unknown, right? You don't know what the hell's going on underneath the piece of paper. But he got to the point where he could go and have a needle. It took him it was very brave of him to do this because, well, what had happened to him is he had a very bad experience with the childhood dentist who held him down. I was
about to say, where did this come from?
Oh yeah, 6 people held him down to give him a needle. It's like, that wasn't so good. It had some long-term consequences. But see what happened. So when you do that with people, you don't teach them to be less afraid. You teach them to be braver. That's different. And so, like, I had a client once, the doors opened on the elevator, and she looked in and she said, that's death. Like, that's a tube. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing response. And her idea was she'd go in there, her heart rate would accelerate, she'd have a heart attack, and she'd die. So as far as she was concerned, walking in there was death,
Death.
right? Okay, so for me it was an elevator, but for her it was death. It's like, okay, well, what do you do about your fear of death? Well, we're not getting rid of that. It's like, you know, and you could die in the elevator. You actually could. Probably you won't, but people do die in elevators. And her idea was that, well, if anyone has ever died in an elevator in the history of mankind, that's a good reason for me not to be in the elevator. It's like, fair enough, you know. And then why aren't you terrified out of your skull all the time? Because while you're wandering around, you might have a heart attack. Like that will probably, in fact, happen to you at some point. So why aren't you terrified of that at every moment? Well, that's the mystery. Well, so you treat people, and you see with that client, what I eventually did with her is we went and watched an embalming. She was terrified of death, like
Date
seriously. Yeah, yeah.
Good times.
Right, no kidding. But you know, so you don't get less afraid. You get braver. That's better because there's plenty of things to be afraid of.